Good. Well, I think we can start. Good evening, everyone. Pleasure to see you all, and welcome to the what is it? Third seminar in this series on transatlantic relationships that we started at the beginning of this academic year. I must say that when now 6 months ago we planned this series, little did we know what the exact agenda of this session would be, but we felt fairly sure that somehow, no matter what, including no matter what happened in the US elections, there would be a lot to be discussed concerning the war in Ukraine, and B, by way of implication, about European security, because the two are, of course, very directly related. Needless to say, after the Big Bang that we discussed in the previous session, namely the re-election of Donald Trump, it became clear that movement was to be expected. And yes, we've seen a lot of movement in all directions, but we remain to see exactly what will happen in relation to the Ukrainian situation. I mean, we heard, like everyone knows, we heard a lot of declarations concerning the necessity to terminate the war, but what this means exactly and what the implications of it will be for both Ukraine, Europe, and more generally speaking, for some sort of world order are questions that need to be discussed. And this is basically what we propose to do tonight. We certainly won't exhaust the topic, but hopefully it will help us to see a bit more clearly what may await us in the coming weeks and months. And as usual, we want to start by a series of short interventions presenting fairly rapidly a series of considerations on different facets of the broader issue that we're describing. But of course, we want to leave enough time for discussion because indeed there is a lot to be discussed. So the agreement is that Nathalie will kick off the discussion by offering a snapshot of where we are and what are the main avenues in which things might be moving in the near future. So without further ado, let me ask her to kick off the discussion. I won't introduce our speakers. They've been introduced in the materials announcing this session. I want to thank them all for having accepted our invitation and for their participation in this debate. Nathalie, over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be back here. So indeed, what I was thinking of doing, and at the risk of perhaps simplifying or kind of, painting futures that are too clear cut, I wanted to try and do a little bit of crystal ball gazing and trying to not necessarily figure out what's in the crystal ball, but what are the possible futures in that crystal ball. And indeed, when we were planning this, we didn't quite know what would happen, but already back then, I think it was fairly clear that obviously there would have been a result of the US election, and that even in the event in which it was not this result, something in the war in Ukraine would have happened. I think there was the sense over the course of last year, over the course of 2024, that 2024 would be essentially a year in which things would continue. And of course, there was, the fear that there would be a collapse of the Ukrainian front. And of course, that didn't happen. But no one really had an expectation that, apart from that catastrophic scenario, something else dramatic would happen. And everyone assumed that whatever it was that politically would happen after the US election. So here we are, now we know who the president of the United States is, and we now know what his intentions are. What we don't know is what is actually going to happen. And so let me paint three possible futures, and I think all three have some degree of plausibility to them. I'm not going to venture into discussing which of the three are more plausible, but perhaps I may imply it, but I think it'd be interesting to hear what our other panelists might have to say about this. So crystal ball number one tells us that there will be a truce in Ukraine. And there will be a truce, which of course, Donald Trump very much pushes for. We have more or less a sense of what he has in mind. Essentially, what we're talking about is a freezing, if you like, of the conflict on the current line. Basically, there would be a de facto, not a de jure, recognition of the territories that Russia is currently occupying, and that in order not to make this truce totally sort of unstable, there would be some degree of a European presence I think calling it a peacekeeping force may probably be the wrong term, perhaps thinking about it as a tripwire force, essentially to create a deterrent for Russia to break that truce, maybe over a matter of a few months, or perhaps at most a couple of years, would probably be there. Exactly how many troops would be talking about, question up for discussion. We know that Ukrainian President Zelensky has talked about 200,000. We know that actually it's not a completely mad number, right? I mean, just by way of comparison, if we think that in Lebanon, the blue line is 82 kilometers long and there are 10,000 soldiers. Well, I mean, multiply that by, at least 10, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about the Ukrainian front line. And, the kind of, that, or rather 20, I mean, that kind of number makes sense. Of course, not necessarily all 200,000 would be European, but let's say, something probably in the order of 40, 50, 60, 70, I don't know. 1,000 people would probably be what is necessary to make, in a sense, a line more or less stable. Another element of that truce would, of course, be that NATO membership is out of the question. Arguably, it was never really in the sense that even under the Biden administration, there was never much of a willingness to actually move in this direction, but that is something that I'm sure we're going to discuss more. But EU membership is very much in, all right, not necessarily EU membership after tomorrow, but an EU accession process that would continue. So more or less, that's in a sense the contours of that scenario. Now, you may ask yourselves, well, why on earth why would Ukraine accept? Well, Ukraine would accept because it doesn't really have a choice, insofar as Trump basically has all sorts of arm twisting abilities that even in other areas like trade, we're beginning to understand what they mean. And then the real question is, why would Putin accept, right? And Putin would accept in this scenario because basically, although he doesn't necessarily have much at heart the lives of Russian soldiers dying, in the hundreds, if not thousands per day, he may actually think that he may need a little bit of time to rest, regroup, rearm, and then perhaps, given that he doesn't really believe in Europeans doing anything meaningful in terms of tripwire and defense, he may say, I'll make my friend Donald happy and then go for the next chunk of European territory and European peoples, maybe in a couple of years' time. So that's, in a sense, scenario number one. Scenario number two is, I think, one that the Ukrainians I'm not sure whether they think this is going to happen or they think they would like to see it happen anyway, but that's, I'm sure, something that then Eugene will get into, is one in which there is no truce, and there is no truce because Putin says no. And in that scenario, in that variant of scenario, so in scenario 2, Putin says no because basically he thinks, well, hey, I'm winning this war, right? I'm not stopping now. Plus, I've got Donald now sitting in the White House, and maybe this is even a good time to go beyond and test Article 5. I mean, he's testing Article 5 by wanting to invade Greenland anyway, right? So what's kind of stopping me? So in that scenario, basically, there is no truce, and then Donald basically says, "Hey, hang on a second. Like, I really don't want this to look like my Afghanistan, and I don't have all of these sort of, these concerns, these worries that weak old Biden had about unleashing a nuclear Armageddon, and so you know what? If you Vladimir, you give me the middle finger, I double down in support for Ukraine." And so in that second scenario, we're essentially talking about a scenario which is an ongoing war scenario, but one in which there is a reinforced US commitment actually to Ukrainian security, because Trump would feel slighted by Putin that says, thanks, but no thanks. Then you have a third and final scenario that I wanted to put out there, which is one in which there is no truce, but in which Putin kind of plays the game rather smartly. So he doesn't actually give the middle finger to Donald, and he begins a negotiation, and the negotiation continues, and it continues, and it continues, and of course the war is going on in the meantime, and it continues. And Trump, of course, is not known for his love for complexity and, drawn out negotiations. And we know that Trump really, really, really wants his Nobel Peace Prize, right? But this may be, after a while, this may look a little bit too complicated. And so Trump may ultimately get bored. But so this would not be a scenario in which Putin does something so obvious and obnoxious that makes Trump feel slighted and, hey, this is going to be my Afghanistan. But it's essentially a negotiation that is drawn out and gets bogged down. And Trump loses interest, and he may end up thinking, hey, I'm going to look for my Nobel Peace Prize in whatever, Iran or Taiwan or, what have you. And so he walks away. So he gradually, there would not be a new US supplemental on US assistance for Ukraine. And basically the bleeding, and Europeans, of course, then the question is, would we be able to step up or not? But Europeans and Ukrainians, and of course, would be left alone. Anyway, so that's, in a sense, probably the most catastrophic scenario of all. I don't want to conclude saying that I fear it's the most likely, but I think it's something that we should be seriously talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathalie. Very good kickoff, which provides us with many options and hypotheses to discuss. Let me then turn to Eugene. Eugene, for those who would not know, has just published a book on Russia's 200-year quest to dominate Ukraine. We are indeed at the heart of today's discussion. And my question to him would be, we heard a very concise summary of what the options on the table are. Some are not very attractive to Ukraine. The question is, how long can Ukraine hold, basically, in the present situation? Because we see, yes, we have seen a spectacular capacity of resilience, which very few people would have expected, but it's also been eroded by now a very protracted war. So the question is, can this go on for much longer, or will the Ukrainian government be in the situation of accepting almost everything that the US in particular would want to impose on them.
Yeah, thanks for now, and thanks, Nathalie. I agree with your scenarios. They're definitely plausible, though probably not very happy ones. But I mean, I think, you know, whether our starting assumption is in this discussion is often what Trump will impose on Ukraine. And I think this starting point is a bit mistaken because, you know, all those states, whether it's Putin or even Ukrainians, they also have agency. Trump can twist the hands and can try to impose, but eventually the decision will be by the Russians and the Ukrainians. There's a limit to what Trump can achieve. Now, in terms of like where we stand and, you know, how likely it is to continue, well, as of now, the war is clearly a war of attrition, but neither Russia nor Ukraine have enough people and material for decisive military action. The front lines are changing, but they're changing very slowly. And, you know, I think the metaphor that is quite useful when you think about Ukraine and also Russia are two sand clocks standing side by side and running out of sand. The Russian sand clock and the Ukrainian sand clock. And the main question is which clock will run out of sand first. It's also important to understand that the sand in those clocks is different. The Russian sand clock, and I hope Kadri will talk about that, is mostly an economic and social sand. For the Ukrainian sand clock, it's mostly a military and a foreign policy sand clock. Militarily, Ukraine is clearly not winning. There is no way to sugarcoat it. It might not be losing badly or as badly as many people expected. The front lines have not collapsed, but it's still facing serious problems just holding on to territory. And there is little hope of major offensives or counteroffensives, such as Kharkiv offensive, counteroffensive, or Kherson offensive. It's losing land. And a liberation of Ukrainian territory, at least large swaths of Ukrainian territory, it's very unlikely now. I would love to be proven wrong, but you know, I just don't see it happening. And Ukraine has two main problems. It does not have enough soldiers, or at least well-trained soldiers, and it does not have enough material. And, you know, there is now a debate whether Ukraine can or should bring more people into service by drafting age groups that are now exempt. Right now, age groups of 18 to 25 are exempt from draft. But it will only be a partial solution. The problem is not just mobilizing people, but also training, discipline, ability to deploy them. Desertion has become a pretty serious problem. And even more importantly, if people are mobilized and trained, Ukraine, as of now, simply does not have enough heavy weapons to support those new units. We're mostly talking about infantry units that are going to be created, and they're just not enough heavy weapons to support them. And it's very unlikely that those weapons will be coming. Now, it's not on Trump. Right, those problems started even before Trump, but the election of Trump likely made them worse with regards to weapons supply at the same time. And, you know, it surprises most people I'm talking to. Ukrainians actually quite optimistic about Trump. They welcome Trump's victory, not because they like Trump and not because they think that Trump cares about Ukraine, but they saw the status quo under Biden as simply unsustainable. You know, Biden's policy was seen rightly, and rightly so, as ensuring that, you know, the Ukrainian sand clock runs out of sand slower than it could have been, but it still runs out of sand faster than the Russian clock. And with Trump, was a hope, and still there is hope for a new approach. Again, not because people in Kyiv believe that Trump cares about Ukraine, but because, and actually, Nathalie, I will probably disagree with you a bit. I don't think anyone knows what Trump wants actually, and what his long-term plans are. I don't think that even Trump himself knows what his long-term plans are. And what we know from Trump 1.0 that Trump is chaos, and in chaos many things can happen. Some of them will be absolutely horrible, but some of them might be unexpectedly nice, and that's what Ukrainians are hoping for. Because if your baseline is that if you are losing anyway, you are willing to embrace and accept more and more risks. We know that from behavioral economics, it's called prospect theory. And Ukrainians are exactly in this situation. We are losing, so let's try something new. It can't get any worse than that. I try to tell people that it actually can, but I don't think they're really listening. And the expectation is that even though Trump doesn't care about Ukraine, he would want to avoid Ukraine becoming his Afghanistan after the US pouring so much money and weapons into Ukraine. I think this actually, and the hope is that this fear comes even before Trump tries to impose a ceasefire, that there are people around Trump, I don't know who exactly, maybe National Security Advisor Waltz and maybe Rubio, that would explain him that a ceasefire is not sustainable, and a ceasefire might just postpone the next round, so he will want to avoid that and not to throw Ukraine under the bus, quote unquote, and to avoid Ukraine being his foreign policy failure. And also, the truth is that after 3 years of war, Ukraine and Ukrainians are exhausted. And many are quietly hoping for some sort of a ceasefire or a truce. Yes, it might allow Putin time to regroup, rearm, but it will also allow Ukraine some time to regroup, rearm, mobilize, train new people, get weapons, get people back. But agreeing to a ceasefire that is seen as disadvantageous to Ukraine will be easier under Trump than it was under Biden. Because this ceasefire will come with a heavy political price for President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government, but now they have Trump to blame. They can agree to conditions they would not have agreed to under Biden by presenting to the Ukrainian public there is very little we could do. It's Trump that is forcing us, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Trump is actually able to force them. Trump will simply give them cover to agree to things that they already quietly accepted as necessary. So overall, the situation in Ukraine is pretty tough, but at the same time, quite a few people in Ukraine are actually surprisingly optimistic about Trump and what he might achieve. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Future will tell, but let's say sources of uncertainty are plentiful. Kelly, I'm tempted to ask you, we just heard the view on the situation as seen from Ukraine. Can you enlighten us on the situation as it could be seen from Moscow? I say this very cautiously because it's about as difficult as telling what Trump's preferred solution is. But given your rich experience and also, let's say, your geographical proximity, so to say, with Russia, it would be extremely useful for us to hear what you can contribute to our understanding of the situation.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Always my pleasure to be here. And yeah, I will give you my modest best understanding of what Russia's thinking at the moment is. And my take is that Russia is not prepared to review its war aims and make them more moderate than they were. If anything, demands have gone up as Russia has been winning. As to Putin's aims, I think the best guidance we have is his speech from June 2024. He gave a speech at the Foreign Ministry staff. This was the second meeting in that format after December 21, when he presented those infamous demands about European security. And they met again in the same group. It's a fairly large group, I understand. They met in June, and Putin spoke at length, and spelled out his aims. And these are 4 regions that Russia claims to have annexed. It doesn't actually control all of these physically. All of these need to become part of Russia, acknowledged as such by Ukraine, Crimea as well. I don't think he even mentioned Crimea, but that was evident. Then Ukraine needs to be neutral. It needs to give up any ambition to join NATO. It also needs to refrain from hosting any foreign bases, foreign troops, conducting exercises, anything like that, and to agree to have its military capped in numbers, basically demilitarized Ukraine. And then it needs to agree to denazification, which is a code word for Ukraine agreeing to guarantee that its leadership will always be friendly to Russia. And finally, all that should be followed by talks about new European security order that would happen with involving Americans, some Europeans, and also some Eurasian countries, probably China, probably others. I think these aims need to be taken seriously. I think Putin really means it, and I don't think he will stop at half measures. I mean, certain things that have been discussed in the West, that okay, maybe we can postpone certain decisions about Ukraine's NATO membership, or okay, well, Russia may control some territory, but we won't recognize it, that is a no-go for Putin. I think for him, I mean, recognition of loss of territory by Ukraine and by everyone else is the guarantee that Ukraine will not try to take back its territory by force. Also, if the West recognizes it, then that would actually be a precondition for Western lifting of sanctions. And also denazification, I mean, it's a ridiculous term and it makes us laugh, but there is substance behind it. I mean, on the one hand, it's about getting rid of Zelensky because it seems to me that the Kremlin has made itself believe that Zelensky is a major obstacle to peace, which is funny because Zelensky won elections by promising to end the war in Donbass. That was simmering before. So if he's becoming obstacle, I think Moscow should really look into mirror and ask, did we maybe do something? Why is that friendly guy suddenly different? But also, and even more importantly, I think Moscow understands under that label a whole package of language laws, cultural laws, education. You know, Ukrainian kids would be getting Russian language education with Russian versions of history, Russian versions of relationship of Ukraine and Russia. So a real sort of re-education of Ukrainian population. It is fairly profound. Why I don't think Putin, I'm inclined to believe Nathalie's Freud scenario that Putin will be talking, but he will not settle. I actually just today had a debate with colleagues who follow more Ukraine, and they were actually worried about bad settlement, you know, ceasefire that doesn't include any guarantees, any support for Ukraine. For them, that's a disaster because that would mean that the country will always be on edge. There would be no secure future, no one would invest, it would go down economically. As there would be no war, then support would not be forthcoming, people would be losing interest, but also as there would be no war, state of emergency would be lifted and men who are capable of carrying arms would start leaving country en masse. And that would actually make it much harder for Ukraine to regroup and to have any army at all. So it seems like a winning scenario for Russia, but somehow I don't think they will go for it, or at least, but certainly not their plan A. And there are a few reasons. I think we are done playing Ukrainian domestic politics, hoping that, in certain conditions, Ukrainian regimes will collapse and people who are more favorable towards Russia will come to power. They did that throughout the period of 2014 to 22, even before. Minsk agreements, investments in Medvedchuk media, etc. When Vladislav Surkov, the famous Russian spin doctor, was in charge of Ukraine in the Kremlin, then I think his moves were largely inspired by how he saw Ukrainian domestic politics and what could happen there. But I think that phase is now over. And demand, thinking seems to be in Moscow that any ceasefire would benefit Ukraine more than Russia, because Russia has its own share of problems. Yeah, I like the description of two different sands. Russian economy really is not doing great, but it's still functioning. And I've listened to Russian economists, and they say that we can go on like that certainly for another year, and then maybe one more year, and after that we can still continue, but then we start accumulating consequences that will be hard to reverse. But for a short while they can do that and hope that we will sort out the consequences later. So they are determined to make use of Ukraine's moment of vulnerability. Because, if European arms production increases, if Europe starts exporting more arms to Ukraine, then also Ukraine could get stronger. So I think Russia has also maybe learned from Ukraine's failure to use its advantage in the whole of 2022. That was the time when Russian front collapsed in Kharkiv, and had Ukraine had the willingness and means to press on before General Surovikin managed to build decent defense lines for Russians, then we might be in a different situation. So I think Russians are determined not to allow Ukraine to regroup. And a few final remarks about Europe. I was asked also at another event if Putin will come back with his demands about European security, rollback of NATO troops, etc. That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know if he thinks that such things can be debated with Trump, who is, not a systemic thinker at all. I wouldn't discuss world order with Trump. I think it's world chaos that would come out of it. So does Putin want to discuss that? I get different signals from Moscow. The expert discussions that I follow don't mention that very often, because I think experts don't think that is realistic. But then again, many diplomats who work in Moscow are actually much more alarmist. And they say that, yeah, Putin wants to come back to those demands. However, what I see happening, and also among expert class, is some reassessment of Europe. And that is very important to me, because, Moscow doesn't have many people who actually understand the workings of the European Union. It's a strange organization for them. It's internal solidarity, all these horizontal links, us muddling through, but somehow managing. Russia is a differently organized country. They don't get us very well. There are really very few people who are good experts on the European Union. The rest of them, however, have lived under the assumption that if Europe were truly sovereign from America, then Europe would be much more friendly with Russia, because Europe would be guided by its economic interests, and these will inevitably make us closer to Russia. And now, with Trump in office, they actually see that it is Europe who is the principled one. But Europe actually means certain things that it says. Maybe we fail to defend principles such as sovereignty, territorial integrity, etc. But even if we fail to defend, we actually really do mean it. And now they view us increasingly as sort of ideological power. the last remaining liberal ideological power, because Trump rhetoric is much more to Russia's liking. I will annex Greenland, I will take canal back from Panama. You know, that's the logic that implicitly would legitimize everything Russia has lately been doing and saying. So Trump is that guy in the way he views the world. But we are the ones who view the world through different normative lens, and I think that irritates them, especially because they don't see true power behind Europe. We are defending certain principles out of sheer stubbornness. And here I would actually want to end with a note of caution that if European troops should end up in Ukraine without firm backing from America, then I think Russia will be very tempted. Yeah.
Well, thank you for this contribution and also for ending on a very provocative statement, which provides us with a very good introduction to discuss the final facet of the problem, namely where does this leave us in terms of the transatlantic relationship. I mean, one used to talk of a partnership until not so long ago. So is there still room for a partnership on the basis that we now see? That's the way I would frame my question to Filippo.
Thank you. I will try to answer, focusing on Europe, on the European side of the pond, because it hasn't been talked about yet. We had this provocative scenarios on Trump's possible attitudes, and then interesting remarks about Ukraine and the interesting remarks about Russia. And since we are in Europe, I'm not certain it is a decisive actor. In fact, I don't think I agree with Eugene that there is no decisive actor in the peacemaking. It cannot be imposed apart from what belligerents decide. Except from one fact, which has been true since the beginning of the war, that given the disparity in economics, Ukraine has about 1/10 of the GDP of Russia, and demographics, it is less than 1/3 of the population. Outside help from Europe and the United States has been decisive so far, and if it continues, it can give the opportunity to Ukraine, and of course, if it stops. And Europe has been, for some time, in a situation of, can I use myself? Thank you. And Europe has been for quite some time, let's say, with decreasing supply of American security, which was very high during the Cold War, pretty high in the unipolar moment following the Cold War, but now it's decreasing. And it is not Trump. It is least since the Obama's administration and the pivot to Asia, that there is a wide consensus in Washington that if there is a major conflict with China, not necessarily a hot conflict, but a major Cold War with China, the United States would not have the resources to play the overwhelming role in protecting European security that it has done since 1941. And so Europe knows that. But of course, it's slow. And it started moving again very fast for European standards when the supply, when the demand for security also increased. So the supply decreased, the demand increased in February 22 when Russia invaded the Ukraine. And for European standards, there has been quite a lot of constructive debate. Something that over the last 25 years I have not seen, both in public opinion. The latest Eurobarometer gives the highest percentage in Europe of people supporting a common defense policy in this century, and in terms of governments as well. There discussions about how to fund a measure of 500 billion, which is what the Commission thinks would be necessary for European strategic autonomy, relative autonomy from the United States umbrella. I'm not underestimating all the problems. There are traditional difficulties especially in defense for a number of reasons. There are populist parties which are not in favor of the European defense. They are ruling Italy, and they might rule or be decisive in France and Germany. I don't underestimate the trap in which a part of European integration has put us, because it has pulled a narrative of a civilian power from which it is difficult to come out. And I'm not underestimating the reluctance of the European publics to renounce their comfortable welfare states to pay for guns which are necessary. And what I'm most worried about is Nathalie's third scenario, because a Putin victory, either on the battlefield or at the negotiating table, could actually disintegrate Europe. We could have a bandwagoning effect, as it's called in IR theory, by which independent European countries, single EU members, would rush to try to appease Putin before others do it. And this could be a real blow. Also in IR theory, we know that a situation like this usually generates balancing, major threat, but by a single state. Whereas here we have an aggregation of states, the EU, which is not yet a single state. And in that case, the reaction could be much more similar to that of backpassing in a multipolar system. Yet something is moving. And I have some data I wanted to show. Of course, the data may not be correct. And I may have made mistakes sort of pasting them into my presentation this afternoon, but you might remember that one very serious institute, the Kiev Institute for the World Economy, started tracking the support for Ukraine. And the first time it did so was about 1 year after the invasion, and it was a remarkable success. Remember, Ukraine has a 200 billion GDP. So the first year, the 100 billion GDP given by Europe and the United States, it's 50% of GDP for Ukraine. So it's a major substantial. And we had a pretty traditional situation. The blue part, the US contribution, is a majority. And if we break down in military and economic aid, then the military part was overwhelmingly American in the first year, about 3/4 of it went on. But the war unfortunately went on. The United States kept helping, but perhaps in everybody's distraction, the Europeans continued, both through the EU as such, especially in financial terms, and also through the sum of its many member states, some of which, Poland, Germany, and the Nordic countries, are taking this very seriously. And if we break down the data to the latest release of the Kiev Institute, which was in December 24, related to data as of the 31st of October 2024, we can see that, of course, by now the overwhelming above our commitments, okay, and below our actual allocations and appropriations, meaning the difference between what has been proclaimed, but there is a formal commitment to it, and what has been done. And you can see that in terms of commitments, the EU has overcome the United States. And it will do so eventually if this doesn't change, and I don't believe that under Trump will change radically, even because in allocations, the Americans have allocated 60 billion euros because Kiev is in Germany, so they calculate in euros. And the EU members are getting close to 50, But given the commitments, it's just a matter of time that Europe will have contributed the most to Ukraine's defense, both in financial and in military terms. So this is an indication that it is not only talk, as it was in the 20s, in the 2010s, when Nathalie was actually there trying to make something happen. Now something is moving. And I think it is sustainable. The 200 billion that the EU as such, plus the member states, 115 billion plus 85 billion. Okay, you have to sum the two columns. What has been given by individual members plus what has been given by the EU or the IB or the Council. Let's put it into perspective. Okay, and the perspective is that it cost half of the recovery plan for the Eurozone crisis. It is half of the energy subsidies which have been paid after the war when we had to switch from Russian gas to something else. It is 1/4 of Next Generation EU. So I think it is affordable. I think Europe will continue to support Ukraine. It is not capable of doing it alone. Will the Americans keep on supporting Ukraine? Well, it's containment on the cheap, which is usually liked by the Republican administrations. Reagan was one of the big proponents of containment on the cheap, because here we are containing a Russian offensive purposes, because I believe that the Russian ultimate objective is to break the European security system and create big problems which the United States might then have to react directly. So the Ukrainians are paying all the blood for this containment, and the Europeans are paying most of the treasure of the containment. So it is a good deal. I wish, and I hope that Trump knows when he has a good deal. I'll give you another indication historically. The United States support to Ukraine costs about 0.2% of GDP. The Gulf War cost 0.3%. The Gulf War meaning the first one, the one which lasted 6 weeks, and it costed 0.3%. The Vietnam War cost about 1 full point of GDP, so 5 times as much. And Korea, which was the costliest, it's more than 2%, so more than 10 times what it would cost to continue to support Ukraine. So I think it is rational for both sides of the Atlantic to support Ukraine until Ukraine has found, I wouldn't say a victory, but at least a satisfactory solution for itself, a sustainable solution for itself. But politics is not always rational, is it? I leave the floor to the floor the question.
Thank you very much, Filippo, for this interesting insight, which I think brings a very different way to look at the picture. Well, there's a lot to be discussed because, of course, all these images of the situation don't quite fit, but we are here precisely for that, to try to help us understand better which of these many possible options is likely to, let's say, develop in the coming month. So I'd like to open the discussion for our speakers, but I think it's best to open the discussion as widely as possible. If there is someone, yes. Indeed, I'd like to start with a student. Yes.
Thank you very much. I have a question to Dr. Tocci. Where do sanctions figure into these scenarios? Because they didn't, maybe understood, but they weren't center stage of these scenarios. Because even if there's a truce and Trump, for some reason, in one scenario decides to keep the sanctions, or in another scenario decides to lift them, those have major implications in Russia's ability to actually use this truce as a strategic pause, as a strategic break. So could you go more in detail? Thank you.
That's a super good question, because, and I think this speaks also not only to sort of Eugene's point about, you know, the Russian sandbox, which is socioeconomic, but the points that Kadri was making about what Putin's calculus might be, and indeed, you know, I think that if it is at all plausible, I tend to agree with you that I actually think that Putin will, even in the event of sanctions relief, actually say no. But what is very clear that if sanctions relief is not part of an agreement, Putin would definitely say no. And so then the question becomes, okay, so if that's the scenario, and Putin does play his cards well, and I think it's only fair to assume that, as I said, he will. How does this play out on the two sides of the Atlantic? And it could be that, you know, on Trump's side, you know, or Trump doesn't actually really, I think, really care about the substance of an agreement. I think he just kind of wants an agreement because he wants deals and he wants to get his Nobel Peace Prize through it. And so, you know, if it ends up being obvious that sanctions relief has to be part of a deal for this to even be a possibility for Putin, it may well be that Trump says, okay, fine, you know, let's go ahead. And then the question becomes, what do we do? You know, what do we as Europeans do? And I don't know if any of you picked up on a piece in the Financial Times a couple of days ago in which there was, you know, there are discussions in Europe about eventually, in the context of a truce, you know, maybe we could go back to some form of energy cooperation with Russia. And it's absolutely incredible, you know, that this is even being considered. And of course, the thinking, the real thinking is, we have all our economic woes and industrial policy, and where is German industry and all the rest of it. I mean, that's the real plot. Of course, as always, this is always framed in much nicer language. So it's all about, you want to consolidate a truce, right? And so sanctions relief as being part of a broader cooperative effort to consolidate an agreement. Now, I think that the sanctions question would, and not only the sanctions question, but also the sanctions question, and this speaks, I think, to the point that Kadri was making, would end up really making potentially a deal hugely divisive in Europe. So I think, of the scenarios that I was painting, I think we have almost a paradox or a contradiction there. You have, on the one hand, the scenario of no truce, so war continues, and especially if that foresees some form of US kind of disengagement in whatever form, it would obviously it would increase both the financial and especially the military burden on Europe. So that's, in a sense, the ongoing war scenario is one which is complicated, especially in military terms, I would say. But politically, there's nothing to be divided about, right? I mean, if there isn't a truce there, then we've got nothing to be divided over. If we have a scenario in which there is a truce and the sanctions relief question is part of that debate, that becomes militarily, you could say, well, perhaps a little bit easier to deal with, because at least it would give you a couple of years to actually do what you have to do and rearm, regroup, blah, 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 not just on the Russian side, but on the Ukrainian/European side. But it would be far more divisive politically, because this would generate a massive cleavage in Europe between, in a sense, the Northeast and the Southwest. And that may be part of the reason why Putin himself, I mean, if what he's after is that of dividing and destroying Europe, he may actually want to engage in this kind of scenario, because it would have that very nice secondary effect.
Thank you very much. Covered a lot of territory. Michael Lee, I'm teaching here. One observation, one question. Eugene at the beginning pointed out that Ukraine is suffering from a lack of forces, soldiers, and a lack of material. Eugene, on the other hand, gave us the impression in broad terms that we were fairly well on track and that Europe really is not doing too badly. How do we reconcile these two? That's question number one. And secondly, particularly for Kadri and Eugene, as we're talking about European security in the wider sense, is there anything at all that can be said about the risk perception that exists in the Baltic states, the Nordic states, Poland, that they may be the next in line? I mean, is there anything in terms of what one can gather from Russian sources or an understanding of Russian history as to whether this threat perception is realistic, plausible, likely?
Good question indeed, and if I may add a footnote to it, I mean, there's one reading of the Russian aggression, which is linked to Putin and many people in Russia's imperialist ambition, empire building or restoration ambitions. But there's another reading, which is, as an autocrat, there's nothing like a good war to preserve your own position. So if that's the case, why set this?
Okay, then I will go for it. So, Michael, to your point, I don't think there is a contradiction between Ukraine suffering from the lack of material to, Europe picking up. Europe is picking up, but it's not nearly enough, for a very large-scale conventional war. And even if we start investing in European defense production, now it will take years until we see the actual results, and Ukraine needs those tanks and those airplanes. Not even yesterday, but two years ago now. And I don't need to tell you, how much time and bureaucratic effort it will take for the EU or for European states to actually coordinate something like that. So we'll probably might be even years before we even get it. Probably the best defense production capacity in Europe is now in Ukraine, right? They can produce, they have it, but they need the money and they need the support. So there is no contradiction here. In terms of, risk perceptions and who might be next in line, of course, people in Central and Eastern Europe, the Baltics, the Poles, of course, they're extremely worried, no questions about that. But it's not new, they have been worried for decades. It's just people for the West tended to dismiss those voices. You were traumatized by Russia, you were conquered by Russia/Soviet Union. It's like, yeah, it's in your system, but it doesn't mean that it's actually happening. Well, apparently it might be happening, and they turn out to be right in terms of, so the risk is absolutely there. The risk is absolutely there. That's what Poles, for instance, investing very heavily in defense production and in their military. I'm sure, so Kadri, I will leave it to you to talk about the Baltics. What Putin actually wants in terms of, where his vision ends, I personally don't know. I wouldn't go into Putin's brain. It's a very dark place. He definitely wants Ukraine. He definitely needs Ukraine. But I think for him, Ukraine is just the first necessary step for something larger. What the something larger is, I have no idea. But it will probably involve some parts of the EU.
Yeah, on threat assessment, people are worried, very seriously so. And maybe even things are somehow more prominent in Poland. I mean, I come from Estonia. I spent much time in Estonia these days as well. My job is in Berlin, but when I visited Warsaw in autumn, I was struck by what the conversation was like. I mean, they took it for granted that Putin will attack the EU after Ukraine. They didn't even explain. I mean, it was like self-evident. And when I asked, but what's the political process or political rationale that will get us there, they were a little bit confused. Does that need to be explained? Well, some experts then, though, they don't consider it totally automatic, but they think there are high risks, some hybrid operations going wrong, or Ukraine becoming a failed state, then it has border with Poland. So there are some rational explanations as well. My own thinking about what does Putin want, or what does Putin make about the Baltic states? I mean, for what it's worth, when I started out as a Russia watcher, and that was before Putin, I was also very worried. I mean, I basically started being interested in Russia because I wanted to know if that country is of any danger to my country. And for a while I thought it was, and then I changed my mind. I thought that, especially, Putin's world up until 2022, his world was very much the sphere of influence centric world. I mean, he would love the Yalta system, or, as one Russian analyst put it, King Arthur's round table, where 10 or 12 world leaders discuss things and divide up countries, and that he would like that sort of system. And I think that he never probably considered the Baltic states as proper sovereign countries. Sovereignty for him is capacity, and small countries by definition don't possess it. So small countries are inevitably vassal states. Question is whose vassals they are. But what I thought, in his mind, Russia had handed the Baltic states over to the United States with United States vassals. And I used to think for a long time that dangers to us stem because we are considered to be soft underbelly of the United States. If some big quarrel between Russia and the United States gets bad, then doing something nasty in the Baltics would be Putin's way of signaling his displeasure to Washington. I didn't think he viewed the Baltic states as an aim in themselves. Also, he didn't big fight though an NATO enlargement into the Baltics. He could have, but he decided not to. And that was for a reason. So I was a lot less worried than many of my countrymen in Estonia. But then again, I don't know if that reasoning is valid any longer, because the world is so upside down, and situations can emerge that we don't foresee. All risks are up. And at one point, you might get the logic that, okay, right now we can take them back, so why not? Later on, it becomes impossible again. So temptations can rise up. So I'm not sure that is even something we can analyze purely rationally any longer.
Like, I mean, just 1 second on this matter of threat perception, because I came to listen decades ago to a wonderful lecture by Pierre Asner, who was teaching here for a long time, on the fact that extended deterrence was something not that rational, because the exchange in Boston for Berlin was not rational, and therefore you needed to add certain emotions to make it more rational. That was true in the bipolar world of the Cold War. It is even more true in a multipolar world, in which extended fairness is less credible. So I believe that a particularly bad outcome for Europe and the world could be a Russian victory or some way of moving forward its imperial ambitions, because it would create very strong pressures to proliferate. And if there is one thing in which I am worried comparatively to the Biden administration of the Trump administration, is that I don't think he would activate NATO's sharing of nuclear weapons, leaving the arsenals on their own. And this is the reason why this week the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has lowered to 89 seconds the doomsday clock. And that's the shortest ever. Shorter beat the Cuban Missile Crisis, because it is not immediate. Obviously, after the Kursk offensive, it is clear that all the escalation is just fake news to divide the West. I don't think there would be an escalation within the war in Ukraine, but if the war in Ukraine has certain outcomes, you could have a massive doubling of nuclear arsenals over a very brief period of time, and that would be worsening security at the European and indeed the global level.
Thank you. I think we have a question here in the front, and then I see a hand in the back. Yeah. Oh, no, the gentleman in the center first.
Hi, thank you. My name's Grant Dawson. I'm an associate fellow that's just joined SAIS Europe from the University of Nottingham at its Ningbo, China campus. I have a question for Nathalie and then kind of a question for all of the speakers. I thought the talks were really, really thrilling. Thanks a lot. Nathalie, I was just wondering, can you present a cause or causes or a certain cut points that you think that would turn events in the direction of one of your scenarios that you mentioned? Are there any particular things that are most vital for these future counterfactuals that you mentioned? That's my question. And I was just wondering in general if the panelists thought another scenario that seems to me that is possible is that the conflict could escalate further. And in particular, I thought, as was just mentioned, perhaps nuclear weapons could be introduced into Ukraine as a defensive mechanism. Putin, of course, would never tolerate that, but it could still happen. And the second thing that hasn't been mentioned that I thought is possible is perhaps the Ukraine war could be linked with the Israel Middle East war, in particular Israel-Iran. And that could be a U.S. strategy, conceivably. The U.S. hasn't been prepared to fight for Ukraine, but it has been prepared to fight in support of Israel. And Israel's enemies have mostly been defeated now, I think, or seriously damaged, not completely defeated, obviously. But Iran remains. And there is, I think, I've detected some talk in the media about how perhaps Israel might wish to attack Iran. That could cause Russia to divert considerable resources to support its crucial ally. That's a counterfactual, I guess, another scenario. But I guess the question I'm really asking, that's just my envisioning of it. But perhaps the Ukraine war could escalate further. I don't think that's really been discussed yet. Thank you.
No, maybe you've already
Okay.
two-fold question here, so.
So what could, that's a really interesting question. I mean, what could be the tipping points from one scenario to the other? So I think in terms of that truce scenario, I think what we were discussing earlier, I mean, you know, the willingness to make sanctions part of this package. So I'm assuming, and maybe I'm mistaken, but I'm assuming that the main variable in whether there is or there isn't a truce is the Russia thinking. And of course, we don't quite know what is there, but I'm assuming that that is the main variable. Not to discount, obviously, what the Ukrainians would think about a truce, but I think they would be more willing to engage, unless it's a total surrender, of course, but more willing to engage for the reasons that Eugene was actually mentioning, right? That they may actually want it going in the space anyway, and actually even looking like they're being pressured by Washington may have a certain convenience about it. So if the main variable is on that first scenario is Putin, then I think a lot has to be said about, as I said, is sanctions part or not part of it. In terms of the second scenario, so in a sense, the sort of US doubling down in support. So no truce and US doubles down because Trump feels slighted. I actually think that going to the Ukrainian side, a lot will depend on the skill of the Ukrainians in building that kind of narrative. And so far, truth be said, they have actually been quite skilled. I mean, you know, this whole, you don't want Ukraine to become your Afghanistan, I think is something that is really a narrative that has been driven by Kyiv to a large extent, and I think rather effectively so up until now. And then the question is whether that really takes hold. And then the final scenario, which is the no truce walk out, I think it goes back to Russia and Putin's skill in drawing out a negotiation, wearing Trump down. So rather than something happening, that third scenario is more one in which nothing would happen. So there's a lack of triggers in a sense that leads to that kind of situation.
Thank you. I think we should try to select now a couple of questions and then give our panelists the opportunity of addressing them. We start in the back. And
There was a question over there to the left.
yes, yeah, absolutely. I've seen this, but I'd like to have a female voice every now and then, if you don't mind.
Thank you so much. My name is Anna. I'm current first IR student here, and I'm actually coming with a recent citation. It just came like a few moments ago from Trump. So he said, I'm citing, "We tell Ukraine that they have valuable rare earth metals. I want Ukraine to give us rare earth metals." I'm not an expert in the topic, 100%, so I ran out to Google, open up the first Washington Post publication, and the article named is "Will Trump let Putin get Ukraine's $26 trillion in gas and minerals?" Quite a huge sum. So I would ask, to what extent do you think the minerals and natural resources, which are apparently pretty huge, will impact the scenarios in which the dealings will, we will see how the agreements will be signed or whatever. Do you think that this might be something, a trump card for Ukraine, or how Russia or the US will deal with this matter? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's come back to the first row, if you don't mind. And thank you. For your
Thank
patience.
you. Question for Nathalie and the rest of the panel. Isn't there a even worse scenario than Nathalie's third crystal ball of a drawn out negotiation during which Trump gets bored? There is a scenario in which Trump can plausibly blame Ukraine for the failure of the negotiation, either by orchestrating something or, the bottom line, in my personal view is that, the US president simply doesn't care enough. And the analogy, the specter of Afghanistan isn't really fully accurate. You would still not see the type of scenes that you saw in Kabul. And therefore, maybe all Trump needs is a way out and showing to the world that after all, Zelensky had provoked, that's, I think, something that Trump has argued from the beginning. There was an element of provocation, of miscalculation, and so if that is the case, and that's really a dangerous scenario because it could take many different shapes, what can we do, to help Ukraine in this already impossible situation that they're going through, to avoid, some of the easiest mistakes or faux passes?
Maybe I see people's hand. Yes.
That's a very quick question. We heard a lot
about what may happen in Putin or in France, shouldn't we also see what can happen in the European election? I'm talking about Germany and France.
Yes, and finally, I think there was a hand raised in that corner. No? Then the question has been, let's.
Okay. Hi, thank you for your comments tonight. I was curious in.
I'm blind.
Can
Okay.
you stand? Yes,
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you for coming tonight. My question is, in the US, the USAID, the main civil aid implementing body in the US is currently in some turmoil that might potentially get folded, or there's a lot of uncertainty about its future. It's played a pretty key role in Ukraine's civil infrastructure development during the war. And I'm curious whether on civil infrastructure specifically or broader financial and legal aid, if the US draws it down or even cancels it altogether with the funding freezes in the US, is Europe prepared or capable of scaling it up? And if not, what could the consequences be if aid levels from Europe have to remain static and there's no US aid to buttress that?
Thank you. Well, many questions which indeed invite us to look at even more variables and aspects of the question, which of course doesn't make it any easier to answer. But let's perhaps invite the members of our panel to pick and choose which question they want to address, maybe starting in the reverse order with Filippo.
Okay, I will answer the first question about the economic resources. Well, first of all, rare elements are rare, not in absolute terms. They are rare because you need a lot of land, to process them. And so they are present in big countries like Ukraine, because there is a lot of land, a lot of territories, Brazil, China. But apart from this, I don't believe that the economic motivation for war are sufficient, especially over the last 200 years. Might have been before, makes sense to enlarge territory for agricultural reasons or getting a few mines for bullionism reasons, but I don't believe that the costs of warfare are outweighed by the advantages of economic gains. So it is irrational. They do play a part also because Putin's regime is a plutocracy on top of many other things like an autocracy, as Renaud reminded us. And certainly he has bodies who deal with those resources which are interested. But I don't think it is a decisive element. And otherwise, there would be no reason for the United States to have invaded Afghanistan, if not for the Hopkins. But I don't think that the Putin trade is something the US government is so interested about.
You, Kadri?
Thanks. Yeah, I agree that rare earths probably not decisive, but I think that Ukraine will use the chance and try to make it appealing to Trump. And among many other factors, that could be something that also matters somewhat. On other questions, nuclear escalation, I worry about that quite a lot because I don't think Putin is prepared to lose. It's just not, and I don't know what he could do. And well, we've had speculation that he was even actually considering using nuclear weapon in October 22 when Russian troops were doing badly. So, you know, at the very least, we get nuclear proliferation because so many countries will see that nuclear weapons are. Yeah, so it's a really handy thing to have. And good if that's all that happens. Israel attacking Iran. I don't think Russia would defend Iran. You know, the resources are bogged down in Ukraine. They failed to defend Syria, into where they had actually invested so much energy over the past few years, and that they had the space to operate also in Africa. And I don't think Iran is important for Russia as Iran, and they definitely don't want to get into Sunni-Shia conflicts or something like that. Iran has been important as anti-American power, sort of counterbalance Western hegemony, and also, you know, as an ally in Syria, and later someone who supplied drones in Ukraine. Ukraine remains a priority. So if Russia has to choose where to invest its military, it will be Ukraine, not Iran. That's for certain. But I think there are linkages. Also in Financial Times recently, there was an article that actually maybe United States could persuade OPEC to produce more oil. I don't know how feasible that is, but that would actually be more than welcome, because, you know, that would strip Russia of its income without impoverishing Western economy. And that would require some agreement with Saudi Arabia. Maybe Nathalie has some views, but that is something I would want to know more about, because that's the card that Reagan used, that Biden tried to use and didn't work. I don't know. Is there anything else I wanted to? Yeah, and your scenario that Trump will blame Ukraine for failure. Well, definitely. I mean, Putin, I think that is Putin's aim at these negotiations, to cause a failure that is blamed on Zelensky. I think he's very skilled in trying to achieve such an outcome. So I think we should offer Ukraine the best guidance we can, because Ukraine, it's a peculiar country. I'm not sure if Eugene, you agree, but it's a funny country. It has really strong society, but still produces weak political elites. I mean, they are getting stronger by the year. You can see that. Today's elites are day and night compared to what they had in 2014. But even so, they sort of look up at the West when sort of trying to get political clues and think of our next steps. So we really should send our best strategic minds to advise Ukraine how to deal. If Henry Kissinger was still alive, I would recruit him to advise Kiev.
Thank you, Eugene.
Thank you. So on the rare elements or metals or whatever it is, you know, when you said it, I started writing in my head what I remember from the geography class that I had in like 7th or 8th grade in Soviet Ukraine, and I simply don't know what are we talking about. Coal, it's all occupied by Russia right now. Oil, well, there was some in Galicia, but he's probably referring to various conspiracy theories or wild ideas that I have seen about lithium, which is present in Eastern Ukraine, some uranium in Southern Ukraine. What he wants to do about it, I have no idea, but economically, probably the most important strategic asset that Ukraine has is grain, because that's the only way to counteract Russian control of the global grain market. I'm not sure Trump is thinking in those terms. What Europe can do, in fact, Europe is already doing. So I think President Macron was very smart to invite Trump and Zelensky, you know, to the reopening of the Notre Dame. And immediately after that, you could see some almost quote, you know, verbatim quotes from Zelensky in Trump's speech. Of course, after that, he started watching Tucker Carlson again, and you know, and it all came back. But I think there's quite a lot for Europeans to do in framing the conversation and making sure that Ukrainian voice is being heard on Ukraine and Russia Israel, Iran, so both my regions. So I fully agree with Kadri. I don't think that Russia will will protect Iran. It's not an alliance. Those relationships are very transactional, and in some places like Syria, we're pretty competitive. And for now, this linkage is simply not there, right? So from the beginning of the war, to my great disappointment, for this fight, I failed. Israel refused to provide military aid to Ukraine and explicitly distanced itself from this war. There was intelligence cooperation behind the scenes. It's changing. So, for instance, last week, there were several quite interesting military flights from Israel to Rzeszów in Poland, which is the hub for supporting Ukraine. That's probably anti-aircraft missiles in large numbers coming from Israel to Ukraine. Probably quite a lot of weapons that Israel captures from Hezbollah in Lebanon is already on its way to Ukraine. So it's changing, but we're not there anywhere near to being able to present, to couple those conflicts. So I just don't see it.
Thank you. Nathalie, the last word falls on your shoulders, so to say.
So I'll tie actually some of these questions together. So, is there a fourth scenario, rare earths, European elections, how does this fit? I don't know whether that fourth scenario is a fourth scenario, it's a variant of the third, because I'm imagining, this is a negotiation which, as I said, it starts and it continues. And presumably if Trump gets bored, he wouldn't say I'm bored and therefore, sod Ukraine. But it would be some variant of this is not getting anywhere because of Ukraine. And so I think at least in military terms, it would boil down to the US stopping to provide military assistance to Ukraine and then let Europeans do what they want. It doesn't really matter, right? And it's their fault, right? And so I think in military terms, the third and the fourth are the same scenario. Of course, politically, it's not quite the same because I think it would be far more divisive for Europe, a scenario in which, sort of Trump says, and it's Kyiv's fault, as opposed to one in which it kind of withers away, if you see what I mean. But I think militarily it would not be radically different. Where I think, and so to me, that is the horror scenario. And I fear that at this point in time, it could be, not necessarily, but it could be the most plausible. The reason why I say not necessarily is because I think if we'd had this conversation a month ago, I would have said it was far more plausible than what I say today, which I think gets us to the other part of the question, which is, and therefore what can we do to avoid it? And to an extent, I think things are being done to avoid it. And I think this also ties to some of the points that Filippo was making earlier, and it ties to the rare earth sort of conversation. Because basically what you can say to Trump is, hey, there's a good deal out there. And the good deal is that, yeah, US continue to provide military support, but don't you worry, you don't have to do it through grants anymore. You do it through a nice loan to Ukraine, which of course is paid by Europeans. And if on top of all of this, you can also have access to Ukraine's wonderful resources, including its critical minerals, this is not a bad thing. Europeans pay for American weapons and the US gets to do, the good part of the reconstruction and the extraction and all the rest of it. And this is not far from what Ukraine itself is basically telling Trump as a way of keeping, in a sense, the US in. And it might work. The question, though, then becomes, and this goes to Europeans, how does this play out in Europe? So basically, if this is a situation in which Europeans do the paying and, indefinitely, right? Because this is in a scenario in which actually the war goes on. How does this then play with the politics in Europe? And I don't know how it plays out, because on the one hand, indeed, you have a scenario in which, given the rise of nationalist sovereignist forces, this plays into, we cannot support Ukraine forever. But of course, it would be, in a sense, in a Trumpian, this is a Trumpian scenario. And so, it is harder for the AFDs and the Fratelli d'Italias and all the rest of it to explicitly act against a scenario which is actually being blessed by Donald Trump. So you could see it working in very different ways, I think.
Well, thank you very much for these contrasted views on a very complex issue. The least one can say is that we will leave this room with, well, certainly a clearer view on what things look like and what the prospects are. The situation, however, remains remarkably uncertain, and therefore we will certainly have the opportunity of returning to some of these issues in the future. I want to, of course, mention that we do not stop here, in the sense that this seminar series will continue, and we have a further meeting scheduled at the beginning of April to discuss geoeconomics, some aspects of which have come to the fore in today's discussion as a demonstration that all these issues are somehow connected at times under the surface. So bear with us, but for today I want to really express our gratitude to our speakers who've done a formidable job in laying down on the table a number of let's say, unsuspected aspects of the situation, which I think help us understand better what tomorrow may look like. With that, I